Welcome to my channel, Africo Tales. Let's continue the story where we left off. When they began to sing, their voices created harmonies that had never before existed in the mortal realm. This was not merely music, but the fundamental language of creation itself. The words that had been spoken when the first stars ignited, and the last words that would echo when the universe finally returned to silence. Amara's voice carried the wisdom of motherhood, the fierce protection that would face down any darkness to keep children safe. Seku's deep bass notes provided the foundation of fatherly strength, the steady rhythm that gives meaning to all melody. The four children's voices wove together in patterns that spoke of sibling bonds stronger than death, of shared purpose that transcended individual existence. As their song rose toward its crescendo, the chamber began to transform around them. The walls of crystallized memories started to crack, releasing trapped echoes of every binding song that had ever been sung in this place. The voices of dead heroes joined their chorus, lending strength across the barriers of death itself. Ancient kings and forgotten shamans added their harmonies to the growing symphony, until it seemed that every noble soul who had ever lived was singing alongside this small family from the Zambezi Valley. But MALAIKA fought back with everything in its power. The lake of darkness began to boil and surge, sending tendrils of liquid shadow racing toward the singers. The demon's crystalline prison cracked not to release it, but to allow its influence to spread more freely through the chamber. Sections of the ceiling began to collapse as the very foundations of the earth groaned under the weight of opposing forces. This was not just a battle between light and darkness, but a fundamental conflict between the principles of creation and destruction, between the impulse to build and connect and the urge to tear down and isolate. The outcome would determine not just the fate of Africa, but the spiritual direction of the entire world for generations to come. The moment came when the family realized that their mortal voices alone, no matter how pure or powerful, would not be enough to complete the binding. The demon's corruption had grown stronger during its centuries of imprisonment, fed by every act of cruelty and selfishness that had occurred in the world above. To match that accumulated darkness, they would need to tap into sources of power that existed beyond the merely human. One by one, they began to call upon the spirits of their ancestors, not just asking for their aid, but inviting them to sing through their living voices. Amara felt the presence of her grandmother settling into her soul like a warm embrace, bringing with her the accumulated wisdom of 7 generations of rain singers. Seku's voice deepened as the spirits of ancient warriors chose him as their vessel, lending him the courage of those who had faced impossible odds and never wavered. The 4 children became conduits for different aspects of the natural world. Zuberi channeled the patient strength of mountains. Tao embodied the fierce loyalty of the pack. Kessie gave voice to the freedom of endless skies. And little Django became the voice of growing things, of seeds that push through concrete and flowers that bloom in the darkest places. As more and more spirits joined their song, the chamber filled with light that had no earthly source. But this illumination came at a terrible cost. Each additional voice meant that the mortal singers became more translucent, more ghost-like, as their earthly forms struggled to contain powers that belonged to the realm of gods. Their song was becoming something magnificent and terrible, a force that could indeed bind the demon for another 1,000 years, but only by consuming the singers themselves in the process. They could see each other beginning to fade, could feel their physical bodies becoming insubstantial as wind, but not one of them wavered in their purpose. They had found something worth dying for, and that knowledge filled their hearts with a joy that even approaching death could not diminish. In the climactic moment when the binding song reached its peak and the demon's prison walls began to thicken and strengthen, MALAIKA made an offer that no one had expected. Speaking directly into their minds with a voice that suddenly sounded tired rather than malevolent, the creature proposed a different solution.
"Stop your singing, little flames," it whispered.
"Let me go free, and I will leave this world forever. I will fly to distant stars where no life exists, will make my home in the void between galaxies. You can live, your children can grow old and have children of their own, and I will never again threaten anything you love." The offer was seductive in its simplicity, and for a moment their song wavered as they considered the possibility. They could survive, could return to the surface world and live normal lives, could watch their children grow up in peace and happiness. All it would require was trusting the word of a creature that had spent millennia perfecting the art of deception. But even as they hesitated, they could feel the subtle corruption in the demon's words, could sense the hidden clauses and unspoken conditions that would make any bargain with such a being ultimately meaningless. It was Django who broke the deadlock. her child's voice ringing with absolute certainty.
You're lying, she said simply.
You're lying because that's what you are. A lie that got so big it started believing in itself.
You can't leave because you're not really real.
You're just the shadow that light casts, and if we let you go, you'll just find another hole to hide in and another family to hurt. Her words struck the demon like physical blows, revealing truths about its nature that it had spent eons trying to deny. The creature screamed then, not with anger but with something almost like pain, the sound of a fundamental falsehood being exposed to the harsh light of innocent honesty. And in that moment of vulnerability, the family's song reached its true crescendo, their voices joining in a harmony so perfect it seemed to remake the world itself. The binding was complete, but its completion brought changes that none of them had anticipated. Instead of dying as the ancient heroes had done, the family found themselves transformed by the power they had channeled. They were still recognizably themselves, but their forms now carried traces of the spirits that had sung through them. Amara's voice could now call rain from other dimensions, could bring water that healed rather than merely nourished. Seku had become something more than human, a guardian whose strength could face any earthly challenge. The children retained their mortal bodies, but gained abilities that marked them as protectors of the balance between worlds. More surprisingly, their song had not simply renewed the demon's prison, but had begun to heal the corruption that had spread throughout the ancient city above. The Hollow Ones who had wandered the streets for centuries suddenly remembered their names and their purposes. Buildings carved from light drinking stone began to gleam with warm illumination. Gardens long dead burst into bloom with flowers that sang in harmonies that complemented the wind. Timbaru was being reborn, transformed from a city of the damned into something that might become a beacon of hope for all who sought to understand the deeper mysteries of existence. The greatest change, however, was in the family themselves. Their ordeal had welded them together into something unprecedented, a unit whose love for each other had literally reshaped reality. They discovered that they could sense each other's thoughts and feelings across any distance, could lend each other strength in times of need, could share dreams that revealed glimpses of possible futures. They had become living proof that there were forces in the universe stronger than hatred, older than fear, more enduring than death itself. As they emerged from the depths to find the desert blooming around them with impossible life, they knew that their story was just beginning. News of what had occurred in the deep desert spread across Africa with supernatural speed, carried by winds that whispered in every language and by dreams that visited every sleeping mind. The great assembly that had gathered at the baobab of speaking truths received confirmation that the ancient threat had been contained. But more importantly, they learned that a new generation of guardians had arisen to protect the old ways. Representatives from every tribe and kingdom began making pilgrimages to meet this family whose courage had saved them all from unimaginable darkness. But with recognition came new responsibilities. The various kingdoms and tribal councils had requests. There were other ancient evils stirring in forgotten places, other artifacts of power that needed protection, other songs that needed to be sung before their melodies were lost forever. Amara found herself appointed as the new keeper of the rain songs, charged with training others in the almost forgotten art of weather magic. The children became students in schools that taught subjects no university had ever offered, learning to balance their normal education with instruction in arts that most of the world considered mere mythology. Seko took on the role of protector and trainer, teaching young warriors how to fight enemies that existed as much in the spiritual realm as the physical world. His compound became a gathering place for those who showed promise in the guardian arts, a school where ancient wisdom was passed down alongside modern knowledge. The family had saved the world, but they had also inherited the responsibility of ensuring that future generations would be prepared to face whatever challenges might arise from the shadows of history. They had become living bridges between the world as it was and the world as it needed to be, guardians not just of ancient secrets, but of hope itself. 2 years after the binding of MALAIKA, the family celebrated an event that brought joy to hearts that had known too much sorrow. Amara and Seku's wedding was unlike any ceremony the modern world had ever witnessed, blending traditions from dozens of African cultures with new rituals that reflected their unique circumstances. The celebration lasted for 7 days and 7 nights, with representatives from every corner of the continent coming to honor the couple whose love had literally saved the world. The wedding took place at the restored city of Timbaru, which had become a center of learning and magical study under the family's guidance. The ceremony was conducted by shamans and priests from many different traditions, each adding their own blessings to a union that represented more than just two people choosing to spend their lives together. This was a marriage between different aspects of African heritage, between the ancient and the modern, between the practical and the mystical. When Amara and Sekou exchanged vows, their words were carried by winds that touched every corner of the continent, and rain fell gently on lands that had not seen moisture in years. The four children served as witnesses to their parents' union, but they also played roles that reflected their growing mastery of their inherited gifts. Zuberi used his earth connection to make flowers bloom in patterns that told the story of their family's journey. Tao's shadow work created moving pictures on the walls that entertained the younger guests. Kessie's wind magic carried the sense of distant places, bringing the essence of every region that had contributed representatives to the celebration. And Django, now 7 years old, but possessing wisdom that impressed even the eldest shamans, led the assembled children in songs that spoke of hope for the future and gratitude for the sacrifices that had made that future possible. 5 years after the demon's binding, the restored city of Timbaru had become something unprecedented in the modern world, a university where students could study both quantum physics and spirit calling, where computer programming classes were held alongside instruction in the lost art of weather magic. The family had created an institution that bridged the gap between ancient wisdom and contemporary knowledge, proving that the old ways and new technologies could not only coexist, but could enhance each other in remarkable ways. Students came from around the world to study at what had become known as the Academy of Balanced Arts. They learned that true understanding required both analytical thinking and intuitive wisdom, both respect for tradition and willingness to embrace innovation. The curriculum included everything from advanced mathematics to dream interpretation, from environmental science to the proper care and feeding of helpful spirits. Graduates went forth to become a new kind of leader, equally at home in corporate boardrooms and sacred groves, capable of solving problems that purely academic or purely mystical approaches could never address. The four children, now teenagers, had become teachers in their own right while continuing their own education. Zuberi instructed students in the earth sciences, but his classes included lessons on how to sense the mineral content of soil through barefoot contact and how to encourage healthy plant growth through focused intention. Tao taught courses in conflict resolution that included both psychological techniques and the shadow walker's art of seeing situations from perspectives that normal humans could never access. Kessie's classes on environmental adaptation covered everything from survival in harsh climates to the proper etiquette for negotiating with wind spirits. And Django, despite her young age, had become the Academy's most beloved teacher of what they called heart wisdom, the ability to see through deception, to recognize truth regardless of how it was disguised, and to find hope in the darkest circumstances. The family's reputation as guardians of the balance had spread far beyond Africa's borders, and it was perhaps inevitable that their abilities would eventually be challenged by forces from other continents. The test came in the form of an invitation that was really a barely disguised threat. The Northern Alliance of Industrial Kingdoms requested the honor of their presence at a summit meeting, ostensibly to discuss cooperation between traditional and modern approaches to global problems. But the underlying message was clear: prove that your primitive magic can compete with our advanced technology, or accept that the old ways are obsolete. The delegation that traveled north included not just the family, but representatives from many of the African kingdoms that had pledged their support. They brought with them artifacts and demonstrations that revealed the true scope of what the northern kingdoms had dismissed as mere superstition. When Amara sang rain from a cloudless sky above drought-stricken farmland, when the children demonstrated abilities that made their hosts' most advanced weapons seem clumsy by comparison, when Sekou showed that a warrior trained in the old ways could defeat an entire squad of soldiers equipped with the latest military technology, the balance of power in the world began to shift. But the real victory came not through displays of superior force, but through demonstrations of superior wisdom. When the northern leaders presented global problems that their best scientists and strategists had been unable to solve, the African delegates offered solutions that seemed impossibly elegant in their simplicity. Climate change could be addressed not just through new technologies, but through renewed relationships with the spiritual forces that governed weather patterns. Resource conflicts could be resolved by remembering that the earth belonged to all living things, not just to those powerful enough to claim ownership. Social unrest could be calmed by leaders who understood that true authority came from service rather than domination. The summit ended with requests for permanent exchange programs, with the northern kingdoms finally acknowledging that there were forms of knowledge that could not be measured in laboratories or calculated by computers. As the Academy of Balanced Arts grew in reputation and influence, it began attracting students whose backgrounds reflected the changing nature of the world itself. Children whose grandparents had been sworn enemies found themselves studying together, learning that the differences between their cultures were far less important than the similarities in their hopes and dreams. The Academy became a place where ancient feuds were set aside in favor of cooperation toward common goals, where young people from every corner of the globe discovered that wisdom had many faces but only one heart. Among the most remarkable of these international students were those who carried within themselves the bloodlines of multiple continents, children of African and European ancestry, of Asian and American heritage, of mixed backgrounds that reflected humanity's long history of migration and intermarriage. These students often struggled with questions of identity and belonging, feeling caught between worlds that sometimes seemed incompatible. But at the Academy, they found acceptance and understanding, learning that complexity of heritage was not a burden, but a gift that allowed them to serve as bridges between different ways of understanding the world. The four original children took particular interest in mentoring these multicultural students,
recognizing in them something of their own experience of being different,
of carrying gifts that set them apart from their peers. They taught them that strength came not from choosing one aspect of their heritage over another, but from finding ways to integrate all parts of themselves into a coherent whole. These lessons had applications far beyond personal identity. They provided a model for how the entire world might learn to blend the best aspects of different civilizations while avoiding the conflicts that arose from demands for cultural purity. 25 years had passed since that night, when a desperate mother sang rain songs in a city that had forgotten how to listen. Now, Amara sat in the garden of the Academy of Balanced Arts, watching her grandchildren play games that would have seemed magical to previous generations, but were simply natural expressions of abilities that had been awakened in humanity's newest generation. These children could speak with animals, could sense the emotional states of growing plants, could perceive colors that existed beyond the normal spectrum of human vision. The world had changed in ways that few could have predicted. Wars had become almost extinct, not through force, but through the simple recognition that cooperation produced better results than conflict. Environmental restoration had accelerated beyond all expectations, as people learned to work with natural systems rather than against them. Poverty was disappearing as communities discovered that shared abundance was more sustainable than hoarded wealth. Disease rates had plummeted as medical practitioners learned to treat not just symptoms but the spiritual and emotional roots of illness. But perhaps the most profound change was in humanity's understanding of its place in the larger cosmos. The old view of humans as separate from and superior to the natural world had given way to a recognition that consciousness was woven through every level of existence. That intelligence took forms that previous generations had never imagined, that the universe itself was a vast, collaborative artwork in which every being played a vital role. The children who grew up in this new paradigm took for granted abilities and perspectives that their grandparents would have considered miraculous, and they were already pushing the boundaries of what seemed possible even further. As the story draws toward its close, we see the ultimate fruit of the family's sacrifice and courage. Django's own daughter, Amara's granddaughter, who carries her grandmother's name, along with gifts that surpass even the legendary rain singer's abilities, stands at the threshold of adulthood with challenges and opportunities that dwarf those faced by previous generations. The young Amara, called Amara the Younger, to distinguish her from her grandmother, has inherited not just the voice that can call rain, but abilities that speak to fundamental forces of creation itself. The Academy of Balanced Arts has evolved into something that resembles a small city more than a school, with thousands of students and researchers working on projects that range from communication with intelligent species on distant planets to the development of technologies that derive their power from love itself. The barriers between science and spirituality, between individual consciousness and cosmic awareness, between human potential and divine possibility have dissolved so completely that new languages are being developed to describe realities that previous vocabularies could never encompass. Yet, for all these miraculous developments, the heart of the story remains unchanged. It is still about a family whose love for each other became the foundation for love that encompasses all existence. The children who once rescued their mother from a life of quiet desperation have become elders whose wisdom guides humanity toward its greatest destiny. Their story, which began with simple kindness shown to a stranger, has become the foundation myth for a golden age that previous generations could only dream about but never quite believe was possible. And so the tale that started with the voice that calls the rain ends with voices that call new worlds into being, with hearts that have learned to hold not just the love of family but the love of all existence, with courage that faces not just earthly demons but the magnificent challenges of conscious evolution itself. The Keeper of Four Hearts has become the keeper of countless hearts, and her song echoes across dimensions in harmonies that will inspire heroes yet unborn to reach for possibilities that even this story can barely imagine. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the Keeper of Four Hearts. If you loved this epic African folktale, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, share it with your friends and family, and let us know in the comments what your favorite part of the story was. Stories like this keep the rich tradition of African storytelling alive for future generations. Until next time, may your own heart be filled with the courage of Amara and the wisdom of her children.